At the train station, a homeless man grabbed my arm and said, "Not this train, never this train." His fingers were strong, despite looking frail, wrapping around my wrist with unexpected urgency as I stepped toward the platform edge. The 6:15 to Boston was already pulling in, brakes screeching against metal tracks, and I tried to shake him off without making a scene. But the homeless man held firm, his eyes wild and desperate behind tangled gray hair that hung past his shoulders. "Not this train," he repeated, louder now, pulling me back from the yellow safety line. "Never this train." His breath smelled like cigarettes and something sour I couldn't identify, and commuters around us were starting to stare. I yanked my arm free and stepped away, my heart pounding with irritation and embarrassment. The man was clearly disturbed, probably dealing with untreated mental illness, and I had a meeting in Boston at 8 o'clock that I absolutely could not miss. My promotion depended on this presentation going perfectly, and I'd already cut the timing too close by staying late to finish the slides. The train doors opened with a hydraulic hiss, and passengers began filing out while others pressed forward to board. I grabbed my suitcase handle and moved with the crowd, keeping distance from the homeless man, who was now shouting something incomprehensible at the departing commuters. An Amtrak security guard approached him, speaking in that firm but weary tone that suggested he'd dealt with this person before. I boarded the train without looking back, finding a window seat in the second car and arranging my laptop bag and suitcase in the overhead rack. The fabric seats smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and someone had left a newspaper on the seat next to mine with headlines about economic recovery and political scandal. I pushed it aside and pulled out my phone to review my notes one final time. The presentation had to be flawless because 3 other managers were competing for the same VP position, and I'd already heard rumors that Leonard was the favorite despite having less experience and worse performance metrics. The train lurched forward and began pulling out of Providence Station at exactly 6:15, right on schedule. Through the window, I could see the homeless man still arguing with the security guard, his arms gesturing wildly as the platform disappeared behind us. Something about his desperation stuck with me uncomfortably, the genuine terror in his eyes when he'd grabbed my arm. But Providence Station attracted troubled individuals constantly, people struggling with addiction and mental health crises that the city's overwhelmed social services couldn't adequately address. I'd seen dozens of similar encounters over the 2 years I'd been taking this route, and you learned to tune it out, or you'd never get anywhere. The train picked up speed as we left the station, passing through industrial areas with graffitied walls and abandoned warehouses. My phone buzzed with a text from my wife asking if I'd boarded okay, and I sent back a quick confirmation before returning to my presentation outline. 20 minutes into the journey, somewhere between Providence and the first stop in Attleboro, the train began slowing unexpectedly. I looked up from my laptop as other passengers started murmuring and checking their phones for service updates. The conductor's voice came over the intercom apologizing for a brief delay due to signal issues ahead, assuring everyone we'd be moving shortly. These delays happened occasionally on this route, usually adding 10 or 15 minutes to the trip, which meant I'd still make the meeting with time to spare. I used the pause to grab coffee from the cafe car, walking through 3 passenger cars filled with the usual mix of business travelers, students, and tourists. The cafe attendant, a middle-aged woman named Gloria, whose name tag was pinned crooked on her uniform, made small talk while preparing my coffee about how the delays had been getting worse lately. She mentioned something about infrastructure problems and budget cuts, but I wasn't really listening because I'd just noticed we'd been stopped for almost 10 minutes now with no further updates. When I returned to my seat, an older gentleman sitting across the aisle leaned over and asked if I knew what was causing the delay. He had a distinguished appearance with silver hair and an expensive suit, the kind of person who looked like he traveled first class even when sitting in coach. I told him what the conductor had announced about signal issues, and he frowned and mentioned he had an important meeting in Boston as well. We commiserated briefly about the unreliability of regional rail, and then fell into silence as more time passed. 15 minutes became 20, then 30. The other passengers were getting increasingly restless, with people calling their offices to explain they'd be late, and parents texting about childcare pickup times. The conductor made another announcement, apologizing for the continued delay, and promising an update soon, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested she didn't know much more than we did. After 45 minutes of sitting motionless on the tracks, I decided to walk to the front of the train to see if I could get better information from the conductor directly. Several other frustrated passengers had the same idea, and we congregated near the conductor's compartment in the lead car. The conductor, a young woman who looked barely out of her 20s, emerged looking stressed and explained that there was an incident ahead on the tracks that was preventing all southbound trains from proceeding. She couldn't provide details about the nature of the incident, but railroad police and emergency services were on scene. Someone asked how long the delay would be, and she admitted she didn't know, which prompted angry responses from several passengers who had time-sensitive obligations. I felt my own frustration rising as I calculated that even if we started moving immediately, I'd be cutting it dangerously close to my meeting time. Then the conductor's radio crackled with a transmission that made her face go pale. She stepped back into her compartment and closed the door, but through the window I could see her having an intense conversation with someone on the other end. When she emerged again, her professional composure had cracked slightly. "I need everyone to return to their seats immediately," she announced, her voice tight with controlled panic. "We're going to be reversing back to Providence Station. There's been a serious incident ahead and this route is being shut down indefinitely." The gathered passengers erupted with questions and complaints, but the conductor held up her hands and repeated that she couldn't provide more information and everyone needed to return to their seats for safety during the reverse operation. I walked back to my seat feeling a knot of dread forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with my missed meeting. The train began moving backward, slowly, an unsettling sensation that made several passengers visibly uncomfortable. I pulled out my phone and started searching news sites for information about incidents on the Boston rail line, but nothing had been reported yet. Social media showed other confused passengers from other trains posting about delays and cancellations, but no one seemed to know what had actually happened. A text from Leonard popped up asking if I was going to make the meeting, and I responded honestly that I was stuck on a delayed train and would provide updates as I knew more. His response was a single word: unfortunate. I stared at that word knowing exactly what it meant. He'd use my absence to position himself as the more reliable candidate, probably even express sympathy for my transportation troubles while undermining my candidacy with carefully placed comments about dependability. It took almost an hour to reverse back to Providence Station, where we found the platform crowded with police officers, Amtrak officials, and news crews setting up cameras. As passengers disembarked, we were directed to a waiting area where officials were conducting brief interviews with everyone who'd been on the train. The atmosphere was tense and frightened, with rumors spreading rapidly through the crowd about what might have happened. Some people claimed there'd been a derailment. Others whispered about a possible terrorist attack. A few insisted it was just mechanical failure being blown out of proportion by overzealous security protocols. I stood in line for 20 minutes before reaching a table where two detectives were asking basic questions about what passengers had observed and whether anyone had seen anything suspicious before boarding. When my turn came, the detective, a tired-looking man in his 50s who introduced himself as Detective Raymond Kowalski, asked me the standard questions about when I'd boarded, where I'd been sitting, and whether I'd noticed anything unusual. I answered truthfully about everything, except I found myself hesitating when he asked if anyone had approached me before boarding. The image of the homeless man's desperate face flashed through my mind, his fingers gripping my wrist, his voice urgent and terrified. "Not this train. Never this train." I opened my mouth to mention the incident, but another detective interrupted, calling Kowalski over to look at something on a tablet. When he returned, his expression had darkened considerably. He asked me to write down my contact information and said someone might follow up if they had additional questions. Then he waved me through to the exit, and I left the station still not knowing what had actually happened. Outside, the news crews were conducting interviews with passengers, and I caught fragments of what they were reporting. A train had derailed approximately 12 miles south of Providence, the 6:15 southbound service that had left just before my own train. The same train I would have been on if I'd arrived at the station 5 minutes earlier. The same train the homeless man had tried to prevent me from boarding. My hands started shaking as the implications settled over me, and I had to sit down on a bench outside the station to catch my breath. The news reporter was saying casualties were involved, that emergency services were still extracting passengers from several overturned cars, that the cause was under investigation. I pulled out my phone and called my wife, and when she answered, I found myself unable to speak for several seconds, as emotion overwhelmed me. After I explained what had happened, or rather what hadn't happened because I'd been on the wrong train, my wife insisted I come home immediately instead of trying to reschedule the Boston meeting. I agreed and took an Uber, sitting in the back seat watching the city pass by in a daze. The homeless man had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known that specific train was dangerous. He'd tried to save me, and I'd dismissed him as mentally ill and pushed past him anyway. Only luck and timing had put me on a different train, the one that had been delayed long enough to avoid whatever catastrophe had befallen the earlier departure. When I got home, my wife held me while I processed the surreal horror of nearly dying on my commute, of how close I'd come to being one of the casualties being reported on every news channel. The derailment dominated the news for days. The death toll rose to 18, with dozens more injured, some critically. The National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation, and preliminary reports suggested a catastrophic failure of a switching mechanism had sent the train onto a section of track that wasn't designed to handle its speed. The footage from the crash site was devastating, showing passenger cars crumpled like paper, emergency responders working through the night to reach trapped victims. Interviews with survivors described the moment the train lurched sideways, the terrible sound of metal tearing, the chaos as the cars rolled and everything not secured became deadly projectiles. I watched it all compulsively, unable to look away, knowing I should have been there. Every victim's face shown on the news could have been me. Every grieving family member could have been my wife, my parents, my sister. 3 days after the derailment, I returned to Providence Station for the first time. I told myself I was just checking to see if the trains were running again, if my commute to Boston was viable, but I knew the real reason I was there. I needed to find the homeless man. I needed to understand how he'd known. I spent 2 hours walking around the station, checking the usual places where homeless individuals gathered, asking other frequent commuters if they'd seen the man with long gray hair who sometimes approached passengers. No one had seen him. The security guard I'd watched escort him away that evening didn't remember the specific incident and said dozens of homeless people came through the station daily. A social services outreach worker I found operating near the station entrance said she knew several individuals matching that description, but couldn't provide information about specific people due to privacy concerns. I returned to the station every day for a week, coming at different times, watching the platforms, searching faces in the crowd. My wife thought I was developing an unhealthy obsession, and maybe she was right, but I couldn't let it go. The man had saved my life, and I'd responded by jerking away from him like he was contaminated. The guilt was eating me alive, especially as more details about the derailment victims emerged. A mother and her 2 children who'd been traveling to visit family in Boston, a young couple on their way to their wedding venue to finalize details, a retired teacher heading to a medical appointment, all dead because a switching mechanism failed and sent them onto deteriorating tracks that couldn't handle the strain. All people who might still be alive if someone had warned them the way I'd been warned. On the 8th day of my search, I found him. Or rather, he found me. I was standing on the platform where I'd encountered him that evening, staring at the spot where he'd grabbed my arm, when I felt a presence beside me. I turned, and there he was, looking even more haggard than I remembered, his gray hair matted and clothes stained with street grime, but his eyes were clear and focused, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You came back," he said, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Most don't come back." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just stared at him, 1,000 questions colliding in my mind. He sat down on a bench and gestured for me to join him, and after a moment's hesitation, I did. "How did you know?" I asked, and he understood immediately what I was asking. He didn't answer right away, instead pulling out a cigarette from a crumpled pack and lighting it with shaking hands. The smoke curled between us, and I noticed other commuters giving us a wide berth, seeing the homeless man and assuming I was being harassed. "I know things," he finally said, "about the trains, about which ones are safe and which ones aren't. I try to warn people when I can, but most don't listen. Most think I'm crazy." He took another drag and looked at me directly. "You thought I was crazy too. I saw it in your eyes. You got on that train anyway." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but he was right. I had dismissed him completely. "But you weren't on that train," I said. "I was on the 6:18, the one that left 3 minutes later." He nodded slowly. "The 6:15 was the dangerous one. That's the one I was trying to stop you from boarding. The fact that you ended up on a different train, that was luck. Or maybe something else. Sometimes the timing works out, and people survive without even knowing how close they came." I processed this, feeling the weight of those words. "You're saying you've warned other people? About other trains?" He laughed bitterly. "I try. Most of the time, security moves me along before I can reach anyone. Sometimes people listen for a second and then ignore me. Very rarely, someone takes the warning seriously enough to change their plans. You're the first person who's ever come back to ask why." He flicked ash from his cigarette and stared out at the empty tracks. "I couldn't save them, the ones who died. I was at the wrong end of the platform that day. By the time I realized what train it was, everyone had already boarded." The pain in his voice was raw and genuine, the guilt of a man who'd tried to prevent a tragedy and failed. I felt a connection form between us, a shared understanding of survival and guilt, and the impossible burden of knowledge that came too late. "Why do you know these things?" I asked. "How can you tell which trains are dangerous?" He was quiet for a long time, smoking his cigarette down to the filter before answering. "I used to work for Amtrak," he said finally, "maintenance supervisor for 15 years. I know every inch of this rail line, every switching mechanism, every section of track, every signal system. I know which parts are deteriorating, which repairs got delayed due to budget cuts, which safety inspections got rushed or falsified. I know where the system is failing, and I know it's only a matter of time before people die." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't mentally ill or experiencing delusions. He was an expert who'd been ignored. "Why aren't you still working there?" I asked. "If you know all this, why aren't you fixing it?" His expression hardened. "Because I tried. For 3 years, I filed reports about safety concerns. I documented every deteriorating component, every delayed maintenance schedule, every corner cut to save money. I went to my supervisors, then to their supervisors, then to regional management. I sent detailed documentation to the Federal Railroad Administration. I even contacted reporters to try to get media attention on the safety failures." He lit another cigarette, his hands steadier now. "You know what happened? I got fired, officially for insubordination and creating a hostile work environment, unofficially for being a liability who wouldn't shut up about problems the company didn't want to acknowledge." I sat in stunned silence as he continued. After losing his job, he'd lost his apartment, then his car, then his marriage. The descent into homelessness had been swift and brutal, enabled by a complete lack of support systems for someone suddenly unemployed in their 50s with a reputation as a troublemaker. He'd tried to continue sounding the alarm from the streets, but without the credibility of his former position, no one would listen. He became just another homeless person shouting warnings that commuters dismissed as ravings. I predicted 5 different incidents before the derailment, he said. 5 times I knew something dangerous was going to happen on specific routes. 4 times, nothing went wrong, and I looked like a paranoid fool. The 5th time was 3 months ago, a minor derailment that injured 6 people. Not enough casualties to make national news, not enough to force real change. Then came this one. The enormity of what he was describing started sinking in. This wasn't just about one derailment. It was about systemic failure, about a transportation system held together with inadequate funding and deferred maintenance, while management prioritized profits over safety. You still have the documentation? I asked. All your reports and findings from when you were working? He nodded. Boxes of it. Been keeping it in a storage unit I pay for by collecting cans and doing day labor. Every safety report I filed, every maintenance request that got denied, every email chain showing management's deliberate choice to ignore critical repairs. It's all there, dating back almost 5 years. He looked at me intently. But documentation doesn't matter if no one with power cares about it. The media won't touch it without corroboration from current employees. And current employees won't talk because they've seen what happens to whistleblowers. The regulatory agencies are understaffed and overwhelmed. The company's lawyers are very good at making problems disappear. An idea was forming in my mind, fueled by rage and guilt, and the knowledge that I could have died on that train. I work in corporate communications, I said. I have contacts at major news organizations, relationships with investigative journalists who specialize in public safety issues. If I could get them your documentation, if I could help tell your story in a way that couldn't be ignored, would you be willing to go public? He studied me for a long moment, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The desire to finally be heard versus the fear of further retaliation. The hope that something might change versus the learned helplessness of years of being dismissed. You understand what you're offering to do? He asked. Going up against a major corporation with powerful political connections. They'll come after you. They'll investigate your background, dig up anything embarrassing, question your motives, make you wish you'd stayed silent. I thought about the 18 people who died on a train I should have been riding. I thought about the mother and her children, the young couple, the retired teacher. I thought about how I'd nearly become another statistic, another casualty of institutional neglect and profit-driven risk calculation. I understand, I said, and I don't care what they do to me. Those people deserved better. Future passengers deserve better. If I can help make sure this doesn't happen again, then whatever happens to me is worth it. He extended his hand, and when I shook it, I noticed his grip was still strong despite everything he'd been through. My name is Walter Gaines, he said, and if you're serious about this, I'll help you burn the whole rotten system down. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Walter to organize and digitize 5 years of documentation. We met in libraries and coffee shops where he could use public computers to access the files he'd kept backed up online. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Maintenance schedules showing critical repairs delayed by months or years. Budget documents proving funds allocated for safety improvements were redirected to executive compensation. Email chains where supervisors explicitly told employees to falsify inspection reports. Internal memos discussing the calculated risk of continuing operations on deteriorating infrastructure. Most damningly, an analysis Walter had prepared 8 months before the derailment, identifying the specific switching mechanism that had ultimately failed and recommending immediate replacement. His recommendation had been rejected as too expensive. I reached out to Diane Levesque, an investigative journalist I'd worked with on previous corporate crisis communications, someone I trusted to handle sensitive information responsibly. When I showed her a preview of what Walter had documented, her eyes widened with recognition of the story's magnitude. She agreed to meet with us, and we spent 6 hours in a conference room at her newspaper's office while Walter walked her through the evidence. Diane asked probing questions, verified sources, cross-referenced dates and documents against public records of the derailment. By the end of the meeting, she was fully committed to the story, promising to protect Walter as a confidential source while pursuing additional corroboration from current Amtrak employees and regulatory officials. The investigation took 3 months. Diane and her team contacted 70 current and former Amtrak employees, finding a dozen willing to speak on the record about safety concerns and management pressure to minimize maintenance costs. They obtained internal documents through Freedom of Information Act requests showing the Federal Railroad Administration had cited Amtrak for safety violations multiple times, but imposed only minimal fines that were treated as acceptable business expenses. They interviewed surviving victims of the derailment who described having felt uneasy about train safety for years, but had no alternative transportation options. The story that emerged was devastating. A portrait of institutional rot, where everyone involved knew the system was failing, but each individual felt powerless to force change while corporate leadership actively suppressed dissent. The article published on a Sunday morning, running across the entire front page with the headline, "Death by Deferred Maintenance: How Amtrak's Safety Failures Led to Deadly Derailment." Walter's story anchored the piece, the expert who'd tried to sound the alarm and been silenced, now vindicated by tragedy. My involvement was minimal in the published article, just a brief mention as a commuter who'd been warned about the dangerous train and subsequently helped connect the journalist with the whistleblower. But Amtrak's public relations team identified me quickly, and by Monday morning, I was receiving calls from company lawyers demanding to know what documentation I'd provided and threatening legal action for theft of proprietary information. My employer, nervous about being associated with negative publicity about a major client, put me on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into whether I'd violated company policy by assisting with the article. Leonard, my colleague who'd been competing for the same promotion, used the controversy to position himself as the more prudent choice for leadership, expressing concern about my judgment and suggesting I'd compromise the company's reputation for personal attention. The promotion went to him 3 weeks after the article published, and my administrative leave was converted to termination with a severance package contingent on signing a non-disparagement agreement. I refused to sign it, hired an employment attorney, and filed a wrongful termination claim that would take 2 years to resolve. But the article accomplished what Walter's years of warnings had failed to achieve. Federal regulators launched a comprehensive audit of Amtrak's maintenance practices across the entire Northeast Corridor. Congressional hearings were convened where executives were forced to testify under oath about their knowledge of safety deficiencies. The Department of Transportation announced emergency funding for critical infrastructure repairs that had been delayed for years. Most significantly, criminal charges were filed against 3 senior managers for falsifying safety records and conspiracy to commit fraud. The company's stock price plummeted, and the CEO resigned under pressure from the board of directors. Walter emerged from the shadows, no longer invisible. The publicity around the article led to housing assistance from a veterans organization that specialized in helping homeless individuals with technical skills. He found a small apartment and began consulting for a railroad safety advocacy group, using his expertise to push for stronger federal oversight and mandatory safety standards. We stayed in touch regularly, meeting for coffee to discuss the ongoing legal proceedings and regulatory changes. He told me he'd started sleeping through the night for the first time in years, no longer haunted by the helplessness of knowing disasters were coming and being unable to stop them. The guilt remained, the weight of the 18 deaths, but now it coexisted with the knowledge that meaningful change was happening. The derailment victims' families filed a massive class action lawsuit against Amtrak, and Walter's documentation became crucial evidence establishing the company's negligence. I was deposed as a witness, describing the morning he'd tried to warn me and explaining how his predictions had been dismissed as the ravings of a mentally ill homeless person when they were actually informed assessments from an experienced professional. The family's attorneys used Walter's story to argue that Amtrak had not only failed to maintain its infrastructure, but had actively silenced the people trying to prevent tragedy. The case settled for $340 million 18 months after the derailment, one of the largest wrongful death settlements in transportation history. My own lawsuit against my former employer settled quietly, with a 6-figure payment and a neutral reference agreement that allowed me to move on professionally. I found work with a nonprofit focused on transportation safety advocacy, using my communications background to help amplify the voices of whistleblowers and safety experts who were being ignored by industry and government. It paid significantly less than my corporate job had, but the work felt meaningful in a way that crafting press releases for profit-driven companies never had. My wife supported the transition, understanding that nearly dying had fundamentally changed my priorities and sense of purpose. 2 years after the derailment, the 3 Amtrak executives charged with falsifying safety records went to trial. Walter testified for the prosecution, presenting the documentation he'd kept and explaining in technical detail how management had been informed of critical safety failures and chose profit over passengers. The defense tried to paint him as a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind, but the evidence was too substantial to dismiss. All 3 executives were convicted, receiving prison sentences ranging from 4 to 7 years. The judge's statement at sentencing was scathing, noting that their decisions had directly led to 18 deaths and could have been prevented with basic adherence to safety protocols and honest reporting. The trial brought renewed media attention to the derailment and the systemic failures that had enabled it. Documentary filmmakers produced a feature-length examination of the disaster that included interviews with Walter, surviving victims, and families of those killed. The film depicted Walter's transformation from respected maintenance supervisor to dismissed whistleblower to homeless prophet to vindicated expert, using his story to illustrate how institutions fail when they prioritize image and profit over truth and safety. The documentary won several awards and was used in corporate ethics courses as an example of the human cost of institutional cowardice. I attended the premiere with Walter, watching him see his life story presented on screen for an audience of hundreds. Afterward, several victims' family members approached him with tears, thanking him for trying to prevent what had happened, for continuing to fight, even when no one would listen. A young woman whose mother had died in the derailment hugged him and said knowing that someone had tried to sound the alarm, that her mother's death wasn't simply ignored, made the grief slightly more bearable. Walter broke down, and I stood beside him while he wept for the people he couldn't save and the system that had failed them all. 5 years after I first encountered Walter at Providence Station, the section of track where the derailment occurred was completely rebuilt with new rails, switching mechanisms, and safety systems. A memorial was erected at the site, 18 pillars of polished granite bearing the names of those who died. Walter and I attended the dedication ceremony, along with dozens of victims' families, transportation officials, and advocates. The Secretary of Transportation spoke about the tragedy, but also about the reforms that had followed. The increased funding for infrastructure, the strengthened safety regulations, the cultural shift toward prioritizing passenger safety over operational efficiency. She specifically acknowledged Walter's role in forcing accountability and preventing future tragedies. After the ceremony, Walter and I stood before the memorial, reading the names of the dead. I thought about how easily my name could have been carved into one of those pillars, if not for a 3-minute difference in train schedules. Walter placed his hand on the granite, and I heard him apologizing quietly to people he'd never met, promising them that their deaths had not been meaningless, that the system had been forced to change. We stayed there until all the other attendees had left, 2 men bound together by the randomness of survival and the deliberate cruelty of institutional neglect. 10 years after the derailment, I ran into Leonard at a professional conference. He'd risen to senior VP at the firm that had fired me, but looked diminished somehow, worn down by years of corporate maneuvering and ethical compromises. He asked how I was doing, and I told him about my work with the transportation safety nonprofit, about the whistleblower protection initiatives we'd helped pass, about the lives we'd potentially saved by forcing accountability. He said it sounded rewarding in a way that suggested he couldn't imagine finding his own work rewarding. We parted without warmth, 2 people who'd chosen different paths when confronted with moral choice. Walter passed away at 73 from complications of pneumonia. Having lived long enough to see real systemic change in the industry, he'd dedicated his career to protecting. His funeral was attended by transportation safety advocates, former colleagues, and several families of derailment victims who credited him with preventing future tragedies through his unwavering commitment to truth. I delivered his eulogy, describing the homeless man who'd grabbed my arm at a train station and saved my life by refusing to be silent even when the world told him his voice didn't matter. His documentation and testimony had become the foundation for new federal safety standards that prevented an estimated 3 additional derailments over the following decade. 18 people died because he was ignored. Countless others lived because he ultimately refused to be silenced. The storage unit where Walter had kept his evidence became a repository for the transportation safety nonprofit I worked for, housing documentation from other whistleblowers in other industries who were trying to prevent similar disasters. We turned his methodology into a template, teaching people how to document institutional failures and protect themselves legally while going public. His story became required reading in engineering ethics courses and government accountability programs. The man who'd been dismissed as a crazy homeless person became a case study in moral courage and the catastrophic cost of ignoring inconvenient truth. 20 years after that morning at Providence Station, I still take the train to Boston occasionally, though the route has been so thoroughly rebuilt that it bears little resemblance to the deteriorating infrastructure Walter had tried to warn about. Each time I board, I think about the homeless man who grabbed my arm and the institutional arrogance that nearly killed me. I think about the 18 names carved in granite and the uncounted others who might have died if Walter had given up, if I had dismissed his warning entirely, if Diane hadn't recognized the story's importance. Every commuter around me is oblivious to how close we all are, always, to preventable disasters, to systems failing while the people in charge assure us everything is fine. I watch for people who are trying to sound alarms, who are seeing dangers others miss, who are being dismissed as crazy when they might just be the only ones paying attention. Sometimes survival is just dumb luck. Sometimes it's a homeless man grabbing your arm and refusing to let go. Sometimes truth sounds crazy until people die proving it was sanity all along. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.